Hello, it's Friday, March 7th, and welcome to World Review with Ivo Daalder, the Chicago Council's weekly look at the news from around the world. Ivo is traveling, lucky man. I'm Carla Anne Robbins, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Director of Brew College's Master of International Affairs program. Boy, I have a lot of titles here, and a former reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Today, we're going to be looking at the latest diplomatic maneuvering over Ukraine from both sides of the Atlantic. On Thursday, Steve Witkoff, President Trump's friend and Middle East envoy, told reporters that Ukrainian and U.S. officials would meet in Saudi Arabia next week to get down a framework for a peace agreement and an initial ceasefire. But about an hour ago, and you can be forgiven if you're not keeping up on this, we're all barely keeping up on this, but President Trump posted on Truth Social that he was considering imposing large-scale sanctions on Russia based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield. Russia has launched a massive missile and drone assault on power and gas facilities across the country. And while this may be for domestic consumption, the president seems really peevish with what the Russians are doing. And this, of course, followed President Trump's decision to cut off U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine and suspend cyber operations against the Russians. They're not being thankful enough, clearly. Europe, meanwhile, is pledging unbending support for Ukraine and trying to figure out how it can back that up. What is going on here? Are we any closer to serious peace negotiations? Then tariffs. President Trump again said it was a beautiful word in this week's address to a joint session of Congress. And after slapping 25% tariffs on our two closest neighbors and trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and an additional 10% tariff on China, Mr. Trump gave our neighbors another month-long reprieve. But there are more tariffs on deck. Can you spell whipsawed? What's going on here? And China. When I listened to the president's speech, I was struck by how little he said about China. So I went back and counted the references. There were 6, 5 about tariffs and 1 about the Panama Canal. There were, however, other hints out there this week we will discuss. Beijing, meanwhile, which can meet Mr. Trump bluster for bluster, declared that, quote, if war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. Although the tone at the National People's Congress was a good deal more cautious and a good deal more confident. How is China feeling about the U.S. these days and vice versa? So here with us to discuss all of these issues from Berlin, Anna Sauerbrey, the foreign editor at Germany's Die Zeit. From Washington, Ken Moriyasu, Washington correspondent from Nikkei Asia. And from his own personal studio in New York, Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Anna, lovely to meet you virtually. Ken, Ravi, great to see you both again. And thank you all for doing this. I know it's a burden to not have Ivo with you, so bear with me. So Anna, let's start with Ukraine. The Europeans, and you've been following it this week, have been trying to figure out how much economic and military support they can provide to Zelensky if the Americans truly cut and run. At the same time, they've been coaching him on how to avoid that disaster and wheedle his way back into Trump's good graces, although it sounds today like the Russians might be helping on that front. So what's your assessment on these efforts? Is there a peace deal in the making? Is Europe going to be able to back up Ukraine if these negotiations are all smoke and mirrors? Can you give us your read?
So I guess we're speaking at a moment where many of these questions are still out in the open. And Trump, all we know is that Trump is pushing at great speed ahead towards something we don't really know what he wants. And I think that's what riddled European leaders this week at the EU summit in Brussels, which was an emergency summit 2 weeks ahead of the regular one, which will follow on March 20th. And they were looking for a response to what they see. And you have named many of these events, starting with Pete Hegseth's visit to NATO mid-February, where he declared that Europe must pretty much go it alone, with Zelensky's visit to DC, which ended in a shouting match, and Trump cutting off aid to Ukraine, or pausing it at least. So here are the leaders of the 27 trying to find a common response, not really knowing where things are headed. And I think the first response Europe gave this week was what they always do. They mobilize money. They mobilized 150 billion in loans to be provided to the capitals to increase their defense spending. This is, of course, meant to please Trump, to maybe get him to keep up your U.S. support for Ukraine, U.S. support for Europe aiding Ukraine. And von der Leyen also said that the bloc will try to increase its defense spending by 800 billion all over the place by relaxing fiscal rules, though this was not fixed at the summit. I think it's also remarkable that the 26 members of the bloc agreed on a very strong statement of support for Ukraine. 26, it really is 26 because Hungary did not join in, but the rest of them agreed that they would still find a common language on that, just keeping Hungary out, which I think is a good signal that they will no longer be blocked by Hungary in the EU. I think it was a good result, but it leaves out some of the big questions. Will member states also finally coordinate closer on defense? Will they organize better? Will they will they overcome the usual power struggles that are already there? I just visited Brussels for a couple of days, and it was very palpable that, of course, now the Commission wants to have more power. Parliament doesn't want to relax its power, particularly over the budget. The member states don't want to give away their power. So in a way, Brussels knows it has to move forward, but is falling back into the same things it always does, like fighting over who's got the biggest say in this. And then, of course, the question that was left out was, well, should we send troops as Trump has demanded? This was not discussed in the statement. It just has one line that the member states will contribute to security guarantees based on their respective competences and capabilities, which is, of course, not a lot to say at this present moment. And I think the third big question, and that brings us back to Donald Trump itself, is what do we buy with all this money? Do we buy European, like the French would suggest, or do we buy international, like the Germans or the Poles would probably prefer? And that's related to the bigger question, like how far can we really trust America? How far from the West has America already moved away under Donald Trump? Can we still trust America enough to buy its weapons and coordinate with NATO on what we buy? So I think these are all the big questions. There were more questions left out than answered this week in Brussels.
Although some of it intended to please Donald Trump and some of it intended to move away from Donald Trump, which seems to be sort of one of the great unanswered questions, because how fast can you move there? Ravi, Zelensky stated his opening terms for any negotiation, as much as he was trying to get back into Trump's good graces. Russian pledges not to attack Ukraine's energy and other civilian infrastructure, exactly what they're doing right now. A ceasefire for missiles, bombs, long-range drones, no military operations in the Black Sea. He said Ukrainians want peace, but they're not going to give up Ukraine. Any sign that the Russians want to get involved in these negotiations? Any sense of what the Americans are defining for a peace deal here? I mean, should we take this seriously, or is this all just smoke and mirrors?
It's a bit of both, isn't it? We have to take it seriously because it's playing out on our TV screens every single minute and on social media. But it is also smoke and mirrors, as all things are these days, in the Trump administration, at least. Look, smoke and mirrors is very important for them. And I think, as Zelensky learned exactly 1 week ago, you ignore the reality TV element of this presidency at your own peril. When you deal with someone like President Trump and the cameras are on, there is a certain way to act and behave. And, just going back to last week for a minute here, there was a real contrast between how the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer sort of presented himself to President Trump, flaunting a letter from the King, saying that it was unprecedented for anyone to come back for a second state visit. All of that was missing from Zelensky's posture. And of course, I mean, understandably, this is a man who's a wartime president, who's under immense pressure, who isn't thinking about playing games, but the games are important as we're learning. And hence the very rapid turnaround in Zelensky's tone the next week, where he's been messaging that he's very thankful. Of course, he always was, but he needs to message it even more, but that he is for peace. And then to actually directly answer your question there, Carla, in the last few hours, we've seen how Trump is now trying to put pressure on Russia to also declare that it is open for peace. But amid all of this is a complete and utter lack of detail. And the problem as well is not just the lack of detail, but the way in which over the last few weeks, Europeans have felt like they're sidelined. Not only sidelined, but trolled. I was in Munich when Vice President J.D. Vance gave that now infamous speech where he essentially said that Europeans needed to focus on their own democracy, on their own freedom of speech. European leaders in the room obviously smelled hypocrisy and called him out for it where they could. But there's a real sense on their part that they need to move on longer term. I say longer term because the short term is impossible. They realize that in the here and now, they're not sure they can trust the United States to step up when they need it to. They're not even sure they can trust Article 5 of NATO right now. You attack one of us, you attack all of us. So everything that they're now describing, which Anna very wonderfully summarized here, is a longer term plan to reorient their defense infrastructure, to reorient their posture to be less reliant on the United States. And I should point out here, our own Ivo Daalder has written a piece about this in Foreign Policy, just dropped a few hours ago, in which he outlines what exactly Europe needs to do in the here and now and what concessions it requires from the United States if it were to take primary responsibility for its own defense. Urge everyone to take a look at that piece. But again, the problem is all of those talks about the longer term doesn't answer the near term, doesn't answer what happens to Ukraine in the short term, and tough calls will have to be made here.
Anna, when you mentioned this, of course, the Europeans were talking about coming up with their own peace plan for Ukraine. That didn't seem to come up yet. I mean, they don't have their plan either, do they?
No, I don't think they have their own plan. Starmer and Macron advised a peace plan, but then there were, of course, different. Then they contradicted each other in what could be in that plan, with Macron saying, well, a ceasefire could be a first step towards a larger peace, and Starmer seemingly taking the point that a ceasefire would be devastating for Ukraine because I think with the Minsk experience, everybody or most people in Europe, and particularly the Ukrainians, are very much afraid of a ceasefire that is not backed up by any kind of security guarantee, that does not immediately lead to a larger peace agreement. And I think they would immediately reject that. And I mean, it seemed to be a step towards what Donald Trump apparently pushed for, also in that meeting that went to be a shouting match in the Oval Office with President Zelensky, trying to get the Ukrainians to accept a conditionless ceasefire as a first step. But I think most other countries in the European Union would reject that. So no common peace plan on the European side yet.
So before we started this, I mentioned the Truth Social post to Ken, and Ken's first reaction was so cynical, so young, but yet so cynical, that this was all for domestic consumption. Ken, you've been up on the Hill this week, and we're going to get to the confirmation hearing that you covered, but what's your sense of the Republican Party in particular? Is there a split between Trump on Ukraine? I mean, are the old, why would he be concerned about domestic consumption on Ukraine? Does he have to worry about that?
Well, that's a very interesting point. There is definitely a rift between Trump and the rest of the Republican Party. Whether he's worried about that, I don't know. But there was a scene from last week in the Zelensky-Trump Vance meeting that I was most interested in. It was at the very end of the 50-minute Oval Office appearance when the reporters were being ushered out. The camera goes back to Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. And in that moment, Vance reaches out to Trump and pats Trump on the left shoulder. And I thought this was pretty stunning. It shows the kind of comfort that Vance has in saying his mind and not fearing for saying it. I could not imagine Marco Rubio patting Trump on the shoulder. And what I think the source of Vance's confidence is that he and his views on foreign policy has been accepted by Trump. And what does Vance represent? He represents a new cohort in the young conservative movement, which is worried about the US being overstretched. They talk about something called the Lippmann gap, based on the journalist Walter Lippmann, what he wrote in 1943, that if the national power of America and national commitments to its allies are balanced, or that there is a comfortable surplus of national power, then this works. But if there is not national power, if it's overcommitted, then there's going to be disagreement and it's going to lead to chaos. And I think that's what Vance and his friends, including Elbridge Colby, are worried about. So I think Trump, to respectfully disagree with Ravi, I don't think if Zelensky had a better game plan coming into the Oval Office, I don't think it would have changed anything, because the basic structure here is that J.D. Vance and his people are telling Trump that America cannot do it all and they have to prioritize. And the only way for the Europeans to get America's support is to convince Trump that China is not the threat and that America should focus on Europe and not the Indo-Pacific. That would be a very tall task. But as long as things stand, America is not ready to fight 3 wars. And that's where I think J.D. Vance comes from.
Although I will say, and we'll move on to tariffs, I will say that they're at the start of this hearing, which we will talk about, Roger Wicker, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, declared that he was really disappointed and dismayed by this televised meeting, and he also made a very strong argument against that view. He said that a significant American withdrawal in Europe, Africa, and South America, the Middle East, will allow the Chinese Communist Party to overcome us. So that he said, yeah, you can worry about the Indo-Pacific, but you pull out of Ukraine and the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. And I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was this Economist YouGov poll taken after the Oval Office blow up. And it shows that Americans disapprove of Trump's handling of the war, 45% to 40%, the war in Ukraine itself. Not yet a massive gap, but not going in a good direction for him. And interestingly, just 43% of Republicans, the ones who will do anything for him, strongly approve of his handling of the Ukraine war. So maybe I can shoot anybody on Fifth Avenue, it doesn't matter, but I thought that there was something telling about that. I think that this sort of, those of us who are so caught up in the old, okay, boomer, the transatlantic alliance, there seems to be more support for it there. It's not just old people, but we'll see what maybe Trump can persuade them. So Ravi, let's talk trade wars. Mexico and Canada have gotten another partial reprieve, no reprieve for China administration, but the administration is also threatening more to come, 25% tariff on aluminum and steel starting next week, unspecified tariffs on all agricultural products and foreign cars for the first week of April. President threatened reciprocal tariffs on friend and foe alike. And he said, if you don't make your product in America, you're going to pay a tariff, and in some cases, a rather large one. Do you see method in all of this, or is everybody going to get a reprieve eventually? Is this the boy who cried wolf? I mean, how seriously are you taking this one?
Again, I'm taking all of this very seriously. But I will say through the lens of what I've started to call a reality TV presidency. So there's very much of a watch this space kind of mode to policymaking, where there's a threat. The threat is then either not followed through, or when it is followed through, There's an immediate last minute negotiation and then it's pulled back. And we've seen this more than anything else on the tariffs, where there's a moment of drama, a moment of will he, won't he? Gosh, this is so crazy. Maybe he won't actually do it. Oh, but then he does it. Oh, and then he pulls back, last minute save because the leaders had a conversation. So there's an element of real drama. And I want to answer this question in two ways, really. So first, the drama itself has a downside because the immense volatility it induces in the markets, in businesses, people are learning on the fly that for every car that is end manufactured in the United States, every single component of it crosses borders, many, many times over. And each of those components, then, were you to try to put a tariff on it, the cost ratio increase would just be so immense. And there's a reason why car companies and so many other companies have been lobbying for so long, saying that these moves would be crazy. They would absolutely lead to higher costs. But not, and believe me, if you speak to any car dealership right now, there are no margins on cars. Like, cars are essentially a services business where 5 to 10 years later, you recoup the money because of other add-on costs. But on the point of sale, no one's actually making that much money off of these things anymore, at least. The business uncertainty is what is freaking out the markets. The fear indexes are high, volatility is high. The main indices have all given up their gains that they made since November. And all of that is a sign that despite all the talk of deregulation, tax cuts, all of which billionaires love, by the way, businesses love, there's an element of uncertainty that is now getting too much. And I think that could be playing into some of the decision-making, some of the pullbacks by the Trump administration. Because remember, it's very easy to say manufacture in the United States. But if you've set up a plant for tires in Canada, and the engines in Mexico, it's going to take many, many years to reorient that form of manufacturing to bring it to the United States. And then a lot of investment, which has short-term costs, maybe longer-term gain, but you need some policy certainty. So that's the first thing. Whether or not Trump is actually serious about all of this stuff, the whiplash is bad in and of itself. But then the second part of this all is whether any of this is actually good in policy terms. Were he to be very certain about it, were there to be no whiplash, and were they to actually go ahead with either the blanket sort of 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10 and 10 on China, or the reciprocal tariffs, which are currently looming in front of us, I think early April now, a few weeks away. All of that, the jury is very much out on how this works out economically. Some economists in Trump's realm, in his world, in his orbit, they will say that the United States can generate a lot of revenue from all of these tariffs, that over time it will bring back manufacturing to the United States. I'm willing to listen to those arguments. However, what makes it much harder is that they often ignore two things. One is inflationary shocks. Any jump in tariffs will end up being passed on to consumers in the form of a one-time shock, which is inflationary, one time. That has real impacts on the economy. And then longer term, bringing manufacturing back to the United States isn't as easy as you imagine because jobs are unemployment. It's hard to find workers to do these kinds of jobs. When you tie that to the fact that they're trying to deport so many people who could do the kind of manufacturing jobs they need, it doesn't quite add up. So the contradictions here, where Trump can sign on to the long-term benefits of tariffs in the way that he explains it, without really grappling with the short-term things that he is allergic to, namely inflation and stock market fluctuation. He hates those two things, and yet they are coming because of the very policies he seems to deeply, deeply believe in. Go figure.
That's a great summary. I want to add another question to this, which is, it is not clear what the president is asking countries to do to get off his naughty list. Reciprocal tariffs is pretty straightforward, although very, very hard for the level of disruption for countries would be enormous. But for Canada and for Mexico, for Canada, the fentanyl thing was absurd. They get more fentanyl from us than we get from them. Mexico was scrambling, putting 10,000 troops on the border. It seemed that they were bending over backwards to do anything that he wanted, giving the cartel people. But in his speech, the president singled out not only Mexico and Canada and China. He took a big swipe at Indian tariffs, took a big swipe, especially at South Korea. And he was complaining that we give them so much military help. That's something we heard a lot about in the first term. He seems to really resent supporting Taiwan, resents military support for South Korea, that we don't pay enough for troops. And what's the read in Asia at this point? Is this really all about tariffs, or is there something bigger going on here about military defense? And how are they calculating what they can do to mollify him?
Well, I have a theory about Trump's tariffs, and in my understanding, it all makes sense. I think this is a tax increase on the American people without telling them that it's a tax increase. China, I talk to the Chinese embassy a lot. They're not worried about the tariffs because the Chinese companies are not going to pay the tariffs. The American importers are going to pay the tariffs, and they either absorb the profit loss or they pass it on to the consumer. And if it is passed on to the consumer, everyone pays a little bit more. But Trump tells them, we're taking billions and billions of dollars from China, and everyone feels good. It will hurt China if the importers go to an alternative destination and get it from Indonesia. That would reduce China's market share. That would hurt China. But what Trump is doing here is reciprocal tariffs on everybody. So it's trying to cut off the loopholes so that tariffs will come in from somewhere. And that somewhere he's not telling us is the American people. And he's going to use this tariff revenue to cut income tax. So this, in the big picture, is a shift away from income tax to consumption tax, which is a very logical thing to do, which is what Japan has been trying to do for the past 25 years. Don't let the rich people burden everything. Let's spread out the tax. But he can't say that to the American people, so he's saying it's tariff. That's what makes sense.
Although it's incredibly regressive at the same time.
So I was watching Peter Navarro this morning on CNBC, and he was asked by Sarah Eisen, if you're so worried about inequality, why don't you just sign a free trade agreement, and then there'll be no tariffs and everything will be free? They don't say that because they want tariff revenue from the American people to build up the coffers. And to Ravi's point, if this leads to inflation, I think the calculation is that the American economy is strong enough to absorb a little bit of the price increase in 2025. And in 2026, there'll be a big tax cut and people will feel much better. And then they lead into midterm elections. And if they can hold on to the House, they will continue this de facto consumption tax. And when Trump leaves office, the deficit, the budget will be in a much better state.
We didn't answer my question, but you really nerded out. So great. I support nerding out here. Anna, he also cited the EU in the speech, but I think the real money quote, was in late February when he declared that the European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it. They've done a good job of it, but now I am president. You were obviously talking about military spending, defense spending, Ukraine when you were in Brussels. Did you hear anybody talking about EU tariffs?
Oh yes, absolutely. Because there's a deadline coming up also in mid-March. The Commission is at present still negotiating with the American side, but these negotiations appear to be leading nowhere. And right now, Brussels seems to expect that these tariffs will be coming. So I do agree with Ravi that in the case of Mexico and Canada, it has this, showman feel to it, where we don't really know whether he really wants the tariffs or just wants to be seen as projecting power. But I think in the European case, at least that's what Brussels is expecting right now, these tariffs will come and they will be reciprocated by the European side. And I think one interesting question that I don't have an answer to yet is the question both of you, Ken and Ravi, raised: to what end does he really apply those tariffs. And I like your theory, Ken, and I can see your theory too, Ravi. And I think in the European case, there might be even more that he is connecting this to his cronies' interests in Europe. So I could maybe think that at some point in the future, he will tell the Commission to stop or end or alter its investigation against Elon Musk, who is in conflict with a Digital Services Act in the European Union with our regulation of digital industries here. There's an investigation going on, which has not led anywhere yet, but Elon Musk might be fined. So I could imagine, but that's just me trying to interpret what he's trying to achieve here, that at some point this will be connected. And this is certainly not the only reason why he's inflicting those tariffs on Europe and why he's taking the blow that will certainly come back from the European Union. Of course, this is about his obsession with trade deficits and with just hurting Europe in general, because he appears to view the bloc as an adversary by now. But this might be another aim that he's also linking to the tariffs discussion.
Yeah, he seems to like the EU about as much as he likes the World Health Organization. He just can't pull out because we aren't members, but he'll probably try to do it anyway. So Ken, China. This was, of course, supposed to be the number one issue with this administration. It seems like we're always trying to pivot to China, and we never exactly get there. So you covered that confirmation hearing for Elbridge Colby, a renowned China hawk. He's up for number 3, the policy job in the Pentagon. He famously wrote this op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal in 2022, and arguing that the U.S. shouldn't defend Ukraine because it was going to divert attention and resources from Taiwan. So he's also quite a problematic one, at least from the old-style Republicans, and they were nervous enough about his nomination that J.D. Vance went up and introduced him, which is sort of unusual for guys up for a number 3 job. So what did you learn about his and potentially the administration's thinking on China? And do you think he's going to get the job? They were nervous enough that they sent Vance up there.
You're absolutely right. The fact that J.D. Vance went to introduce Colby really is symbolic of how important his position is. And Elbridge Colby, I think, personifies the path forward for this administration. And this was a really interesting hearing. So in the foreign policy community, if there are 3 factions, there's the global premises like Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo, and the Democrat Party, who want to help Ukraine, who want to help Israel, who want to help Taiwan, triple the defense budget. Those are the premises. And then Elbridge Colby is considered a prioritizer. Let's not be too engaged in Ukraine and the Middle East. We need to focus all our attention on China, prioritize, strategic prioritization. And then there are the restrainers like J.D. Vance, and Trump himself is a restrainer, I think, who are more like, America first. We will commit to our allies, but certainly not Ukraine. Taiwan is not a treaty ally. America is not treaty obliged to defend Taiwan. So they would prefer to be a little bit more ambiguous about Taiwan. What was really interesting about this hearing is that Elbridge Colby, I think, shifted from prioritizer to a little bit more towards the restrainers. And it's about the strategic line of defense. Where does America's interests lead up to? Up to where does America have to defend? And Elbridge Colby's position, like you said in the Wall Street Journal article, was Taiwan. Taiwan, his argument until 2022 was, if we lose Taiwan, that will be the end of this American alliance system. Therefore, it's symbolic, not because Taiwan itself is important, but because America, the message it would send to the rest of the allies would immediately trigger a collapse of the system. I think what he was asked by Tom Cotton, if Taiwan is an existential interest to America, and Elbridge Colby said, no, Taiwan is not an existential interest to America, but it is in America's core interest to prevent Chinese hegemony in the region. And I've been talking to the restrainers that support JD Vance, and they have been saying the strategic line of defense has moved from Taiwan to Japan. And Japan, they will defend. But in terms of Taiwan, they have shifted back to strategic ambiguity. Of course, Biden on 4 occasions said he would defend Taiwan. But the Trump administration, I think, is drawing the line with Japan, and regarding Korea and Taiwan, they have made it more ambiguous. And especially on Taiwan, they've conditioned it to Taiwan's own defense spending, 10% of GDP, Elbridge Copy said. And also, when asked about why he's changed his position, Elbridge Copy said the facts on the ground, there's been a dramatic deterioration of the power balance. China is much stronger now. If you compare the shipbuilding capacity, it has 232 times the amount shipbuilding capability of the American side. One shipyard in Shanghai has more capacity than the entire American shipbuilding community combined. So I think what Elbridge Copy told us is that what we need right now, what the Trump administration needs now, is for Taiwan to increase its defense spending from 2.45% to 10% of GDP. They need Japan to increase from 2% to 3% of GDP and hold off China for the time being while America rebuilds its defense industrial base. I think this is the American Trump administration's China policy, and we saw it for the first time in the Colby hearing.
Wow. Okay. So odds are he's going to make it through. And because he's, as much as Wicker complained, I mean, they have a big push from this. Ravi, we may not be spending a lot of time, or at least the administration, talking about China. How about the Chinese? What are they focused on? I know at the start of the Congress, the Premier Li Qiang announced that China is going to again boost its defense spending by 7.2%. I mean, if Bridge Colby's up there sounding insecure about our defense industrial base capabilities, are the Chinese feeling pretty secure? They're out there pushing they're not just in the Taiwan Straits, they're out there running around there. Are they sitting back and enjoying what's going on here? I mean, their economy's not so great.
Yeah, so that's the trade-off, right? I think it's a mixed picture. They have a fair number of internal problems, economic issues that they need to sort out. But they're probably looking at the United States warily because Trump is so unpredictable. I think when you speak to the Chinese, that is the main thing they worry about. They have now developed comebacks to potential tariffs. I think they also understand that they are less exposed to the American economy than they were in 2016. So tariffs are going to hurt them less than they would have before. And as Ken pointed out, tariffs impact the importer, not the exporter. So they're also deeply aware that much of this is internal theater, and they're willing to go along with that, in as much as it doesn't change their sort of longer term objectives here. Which I think very much remain the same. I mean, they've been talking about multipolarity for many years. Strangely enough, it is China now that is often seen as the bigger defender of the rules-based order rather than the United States. Something
Marco Rubio is talking about multipolarity now.
That is true. This is a new thing that is emerging in the United States, where the US and China sound similar sometimes. America is no longer talking about unipolarity, but multipolarity. But, one way of looking at this, and I've been thinking about this issue a bit, so let me float out a piece that will run in Foreign Policy next week. I'm going to name check and thank the person who's writing it, Nicolas Becain at Yale Law School. He's a great China expert. And one way to think about why this seemingly scattershot approach to foreign policy on Trump's part, what is the grand thesis behind it? And one explanation, and this is Nicolas' explanation, it's going to run on our site in about 2 or 3 days. His explanation is that if you look at the world as a contest between democracies and autocracies, so regime competition, and for autocracies to do better, democracies necessarily have to do worse because it's a zero-sum competition, and vice versa. If you look at the world as such, then a lot of what Trump is doing, whether it is, pulling away from Europe, whether it is weakening the press, whether it is admiringly looking at China or Hungary or Russia, a lot of that has the cumulative effect of doing a solid for Team Autocrat and hurting Team Democrat. And again, I'm not saying I agree with this theory. I'm just saying it's an interesting theory to process. And to come back to your question here, Carla, where China fits into this is very interesting, because if you begin to think about, a lot of the Trump administration's moves as reorienting how America thinks about democracies versus autocracies, then suddenly the problems with China are not as stark and severe as they might seem. And, a lot of what Trump has been talking about with, Chinese manufacturing, China trade manipulation, correcting the trade deficit, some of that could also be a lead up to some sort of a larger deal between the United States and China. And he could be setting the stage for that. So, and it's very interesting to me as well that the big early moves in this administration have not concerned China. They have concerned U.S. allies, Canada, Mexico, Europe, a little bit of the Middle East. But those are the big moves. He is targeting allies before targeting what we all thought was the United States' biggest adversary. So some of this is mind-bending, but there might be a cohesive thesis behind it as well.
A pretty chilling cohesive thesis. And if you put the J.D. Vance speech in too, that's the yay team autocracy. I mean, that's a pretty chilling thesis. So Anna, last word, apologies, a big question in a short period of time. The U.S. spent, certainly in the Biden administration, and before that, spent quite a lot of time working hard to drag Europe away from the temptation of China. The Chinese spent a lot of time trying to drag Europe away from the United States. They were trying to make, all that time Wang Yi spent running around Europe. The more Trump tries to beat up on the EU, do the Chinese have more of a chance now with the Europeans?
In a way, yes. But I just want to quickly respond to what Ken and Ravi have been saying. I really like this conversation because what you're putting out is theses and hypotheses about what a coherent Trump foreign policy might look like. And I think we should try to do that. I still find it hard. While he's throwing out 100 data points a week to sort which ones belong to the grand strategy, that certainly is there in people like Albert Colby, who do have a very cohesive worldview and follow certain goals and try to push them through to Trump, and which ones are just hunches, instinct, cronyism, and so forth. So and I think that also goes to your question, how much will he pressure Europe to follow him on a Grand China strategy? I think he will certainly try to do that. And is he going to achieve it? I think he's at the same time making it harder by inflicting tariffs on the Europeans, by inflicting the cost of the war in Ukraine more on Europeans. So he's narrowing Europe's ability to do what Europe had actually already agreed on, even Germany, to de-risk from China, not to decouple, but to de-risk from China. I mean, that was clearly the path many of the larger European member states had taken in the past years, including Germany, which is one of those most dependent on the Chinese markets. But now we have to look in all sorts of different directions at the same time. Of course, we can try to find third-party trading partners which are not China and not the United States. But this is very troubling to do in a time of, strained households, the German economy being in a crisis, many of the other larger economies in Europe being in a crisis too. So he may push that, and I think there's certainly a European political willingness to see China more as not just as a competitor, but as a systemic rival. Which we have to be very cautious of, but he's also cutting our ability to do so. So I'm not sure how far this will go.
Wow, this has been a great conversation. I just want to thank you all. I did do international relations theory when I was in graduate school, but I've tried to resist it. But you guys have gotten me back into it. Thank you so much. That's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Ravi Agrawal of Foreign Policy, Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia, and Anna Sauerbrey of Die Zeit for a great conversation. I promise the redoubtable Ivo Daalder will be back next week. We hope to see you all then. And stay safe and as sane as possible as anyone could possibly be these days. So see you all soon. Thanks, guys.